Good day. I am Dr. Olivia Bomester, and I will be speaking about an investigation on the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity pertaining to adolescent sexual attitudes. You may wonder what is exactly meant by religiosity. And as we can see on the next slide, religiosity refers to the strength of one's religious beliefs or convictions. It is a term that is divided up into two components, namely the intrinsic and the extrinsic elements. Now, individuals who possess an intrinsic religious orientation view their religiosity as something that is fundamental to their lives. In other words, they see religion as a primary source of motivation in their lives. Individuals who possess an extrinsic religiosity essentially use their religious practices instrumentally, and this means that they use their religion to achieve personal and social aspirations. And so research has actually demonstrated a serious need for empirical focused attention regarding these two elements, intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. Faith communities can and actually do play significant roles in the sexual morality of adolescents. Regarding the purpose of my study, the purpose of the study was to determine the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity regarding the sexual attitudes of individuals attending Christian faith-based schools in the Western Cape province of South Africa. The Western Cape province is located right at the tip of South Africa. Now, I had two independent variables and four dependent variables for this particular study. And you can see that the two independent variables were intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic religiosity. The sexual attitudes dependent variable was actually divided up into four components, namely permissiveness, birth control, communion, and instrumentality. I also generated 8 particular hypotheses, which you can see reflected over here on the next slide, where I had a look then at the relationship between high levels of intrinsic religiosity and high levels of extrinsic religiosity in relation to all of these dependent variables. And I will be discussing that in today's presentation. Now, in terms of the participants, I worked with 900 adolescent participants, and 43% of them were male, while 57% of them were female. They ranged anywhere between 12 and 19 years old and were in grades 8 to 12. And in terms of the racial distribution, they were colored, whites, Indian, and black. And so they were a very integrated group of individuals who took part in this particular study. Now, if we move on, you can have a look at my measures. I designed a self-designed structured biographical questionnaire used to collect relevant biographical information such as gender, date of birth, age, race group, religious group, etc. And then I had a look then at utilizing 2 scales. The one being the Age Universal IE scale 12, the AWI 12. IE stands for intrinsic, extrinsic. And this particular scale taps into religiosity. I also made use of the BSAS. The BSAS stands for the Brief Sexual Attitudes Scale, and the BSAS actually measures sexual attitudes. And as you can see over here on the next slide, this is a schematic presentation then of the responses of the AWI 12, where you will find that there were a number of items and teenagers had to either select yes or no, or there was also an option where they were maybe not certain how to actually answer. And so here you can see the majority of the yes answers reflected in the blue and the no answers to all of the items reflected then in the pink. And I will be discussing this in a little while. If we move on, you can see that the next schematic actually shows the answers to the brief sexual attitude scale. And over here, there were once again a number of items listed in the survey, and teenagers had to choose anywhere between strongly agreeing with a statement and strongly disagreeing with a particular statement. So the researchers' aim was to determine how intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity actually play a role in the sexual attitudes of adolescents. And so I made use of structured equation modeling. I felt that this was appropriate to utilize in order to test multiple paths between independent and dependent variables. And so the results in the following table present the impact of the intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity on adolescent sexual attitudes. And you will see that the center column actually shows the beta and the p-value coefficients. According to Glenn, 2016, a standardized beta coefficient refers to the strength of the effect of each individual variable to the dependent variable. Thus, the higher the value, the stronger the effects. To assess significance, the researcher looked at the p-values. McLeod, 2019, states that the p-value less than 0.05 is statistically significant, while a p-value higher than 0.05 is not statistically significant. And so over here, you can have a look then at the figure. And in the center, we have the beta and the p-value coefficients. And on the left-hand side, we have all of the different variables. And in conclusion, you will see that some of the hypotheses were actually found to be supported by the data, and only two of the hypotheses were not supported then by the data. And I'm going to be spending some time in the next few minutes actually discussing some of these very important data findings. And so let's move on to the next slide over here. Now, once again, to remind everybody, I did a quantitative study with about 900 individuals who were considered to be adolescent learners. And I was interested then in the relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity on their sexual attitudes. So if we have a look then at some of the information that came out of the IWE 12, we find over here that when it comes to intrinsic religiosity, it actually encompasses a number of elements. And one of the elements which is very vital is prayer. And so we will find then that the majority of the respondents, 76.12%, stated that it is vital for them to spend very important time in prayer. And this is a very, very important element in personal religiosity, according to Hall 2022. Now, there was another researcher called Walesa, and this researcher came up with a model, a seminal model regarding the stages which human beings go through when they are establishing a positive relationship with God. And as you can see, here's information pertaining to this particular model from the time when we are very small and as we actually go through our different developmental stages. And if you have a look over here on the next slide, when it comes to the ages of 12 to 17 years old, what usually happens is at this particular age, adolescents would have accepted or internalized what they have been taught by their religion. However, sometimes they can reject certain elements then as well. During the stage of autonomous religiosity, prayer assumes the form of an internal dialogue with God. In early adolescence, we find that individuals, they will oftentimes pray mindless, formula-like prayers, where they are maybe not even thinking really about what they are saying. But as they get a little bit older, as they move into later adolescence, you will find then that these individuals, they start developing more of a personal prayer life. And it is important then that adults encourage adolescents to engage in casual personal praying, both verbally and then even in their mind. The results in this investigation reveal that since adolescents reported that personal prayer is very important to them, adults, such as educators and parents, could play their role in encouraging adolescents to engage in personal prayer, as this is a very strong building block regarding intrinsic religiosity. And then on the next slide over here, you will find then some information then, which is very important. And what came out very strongly then is also the importance then of attending different church services, because this also seems to really encourage intrinsic religiosity. And so attending various services, church services, would also be something that is very, very important. When it comes into the BSAS, you will find that the majority of the respondents disagreed with items on the BSAS pertaining to casual sex. All data findings on the BSAS were statistically significant. In all of these items, the majority of the participants strongly disagreed with the statements, and this is indicative of generally having negative attitudes towards having casual sex, which is actually a very, very good thing. Now, if we move on a little bit further, you will find that there's some data findings pertaining then to how adolescents feel about birth control. And over here, you will be able to see that a lot of them actually had very positive attitudes then towards birth control, which is again a very, very good thing, because if adolescents are sexually active, we do want to encourage them to also be sexually responsible by making use then of birth control or contraceptive devices. However, it must be pointed out that with a lot of these adolescents who are very, very religious, sometimes we find that certain researchers point out that sometimes they would engage in less safe sex practices, such as condom usage, for example. This is consistent with what is pointed out by Regeneris, who stated that religious adolescents who commit themselves to sexual abstinence before marriage may fail to protect themselves if they become sexually active. Planning contraception might suggest the intent to engage in sexual intercourse and an abandonment of commitment to remain abstinent. While the scores reveal the strongest elements of agreement regarding birth control and who should be assuming responsibility, the percentages are also concerning regarding the neutrality to strongly disagreements then as well. And then if we move on to the next slide, you will find out that there were obviously a number of individuals that also commented then on their attitudes towards the emotional meaning then of sex. Detailed analysis revealed that the majority of the participants strongly agreed with the statements within the communion scale, which has to do then with the emotional meaning then of sex. And so, generally speaking, if one looks at this particular category, communion is equivalent to the emotional meaning of sex, which had a positive connotation to it. It is essential that effective sexuality education focuses on positive, affirming aspects of sex. However, sex would need to be placed within its proper context, according to the Christian value system. Let's move on to the next aspect over here, and when it comes to the BSAS and the sexual attitudes then towards the physical pleasure of sex, as you can see on the board, a lot of the teenagers actually had very neutral attitudes towards some of the statements pertaining then to the physical pleasure of sex. And when it comes then to possible reasons as to why they have these neutral attitudes, a possible reason for the general neutrality which exists could be because adolescents may traditionally receive sexuality education with a strong negative emphasis, i.e. teachers and parents focusing very strongly then on acquiring diseases and things that can go wrong with you. Or they may not necessarily be very opinionated regarding the positive qualities associated with the physical pleasure then of sex. And so when it comes into the conclusion and the recommendations, it is very, very important then for individuals who specifically work at Christian faith-based schools to develop guidelines for educational curricula, but the emphasis definitely needs to be placed on utilizing intrinsic religiosity as a means to militate against adolescent risky sexual behavior. We have some researchers such as Macmillan that have argued that faith communities such as Christian faith-based schools should provide effective sexuality educational programs, and they should really focus a lot then on the personal relationship then between the adolescent and God, and they should also then be focusing a lot on nourishing a value system which is in line with what is taught then in the Bible. What could be effective regarding this would be using the social control perspective as a foundation for molding religious beliefs and values. This theoretical foundation assumes the religion endorses values that are in line with conventional behavior because it socializes members to adopt the norms and values of the group. And then finally, when it comes then to life orientation teachers, they would eventually need to move away from simply laying the foundation for adolescents conforming simply to fit into their religious communities. So they have a role in developing adolescents' personal religiosity. Educators could encourage learners to engage in personal prayer and also frequently attend and get involved in religious services, as doing all of these things will greatly militate against adolescent risky sexual behavior. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.